Hey there, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of the Wholism class. So this week, as you saw in the syllabus and on Blue Line, we are talking about another, I guess, a sort of a deeper concept as we keep moving through this idea of holism, and what are, perhaps some of the standout points for us to maybe wrap our arms around it before we're finished with this 8 weeks of class. But this week we're on the idea of balancing inner and outer. And so this takes a little bit of unpacking, as they say, to try to figure out what does that mean. So of course in Chronically American it talks about it in there, but maybe just to give a little, a little extra insight on it from my perspective. Sometimes as these videos do, I think they help just to maybe hear me explain it in a different way, or give a little more context to it. But I think a good place to start for this is looking at one of the Jesuit charisms, as they say. So the Ignatian charism, Saint Ignatius, the Jesuit schools, they talk about a particular characteristic or way of life, as in St. Ignatius explained it, as in being a contemplative in action. And I think that's probably a good place for us to start, talking about inner and outer balance, because that's essentially what it is. Okay, so being a contemplative, and that might be a new word or some new language. Certainly I was not very familiar with what contemplation or being a contemplative meant before I came to Creighton. And I think, in full disclosure, I was probably there 15 years before I actually was able to kind of put my arms around just that term in itself. But contemplation is a greater, a deeper, a more in-depth way of knowing. And you were so, and I think we probably talked about this already, we're so used to in this country, in the West, for sure, to look at just our intellectual reasoning, our intellectual minds as our only way of knowing something. I'll read it in a book, and then I'll be able to say what it said, or hear a lecture, and I'll be able to maybe repeat what was said in the lecture. And that's certainly a way of knowing, but it's not the only way of knowing. And using our intellectual way of knowing with our other ways of knowing is where we're moving towards being contemplative. And I think some of those things may have been evident, I think maybe last week when we looked at the Heart Math Institute, and just one little snippet of our heart brain, as sometimes people call it, as our way of knowing through our heart and in our heart and by our heart. But there's also other ways, and this is not just stopping at the sentimental, love part. There's so much more to that, and so much more depth to that. But the heart way of knowing certainly is one way. Another way of knowing, along with our heart brain and our intellectual brain. But there's also a physical brain too that goes with that, and I just mean to say that as in descriptively, but there's ways of knowing that we experience through our physical body. One good example would be picking up a skill like riding your bike. It's hard to reason through that, and although some people try. I had a friend of mine in college who used to reason his way through trying to figure out how to juggle. And I'm like, dude, it's not how you do this. You just have to practice and know and feel the rhythm and the muscle memory and the coordination and neuromuscular, and all of that comes together in a way of knowing. So the balance that you have when you first learn how to ride a bike, or the coordination that you get practicing juggling or shooting a basketball, or whatever it is, is also a way of knowing. And there are many of those. Those are just three examples. But being a contemplative is tapping into all of these ways of knowing. And the only way we can do that is to be more conscious. Okay, so to have greater awareness. And that's one of the main themes of this course is enhancing our level of consciousness, or another way to say it would just be being aware of what's going on around us, and through us and in us and between us and all ways of our present experience. So there's a lot of talk about being present these days, and how much advantage people have with their overall happiness and health and mental health, physical health, emotional health, spiritual health, if you are becoming more present. But that's hard, really, really hard for us to do, mostly because, okay, I can be present with you. We can be sitting together, say in a coffee shop, drinking coffee, but I might be somewhere else. And the presence is mostly what we're doing in this control tower that sits on our shoulders. What do we have the squirrel brain that's gets distracted very easily and is thinking about something else while we're having coffee with a friend, and that's we all do it. We're all there. I mean, in class we do it at the same time. You might even be doing it listening to this video right now. But being present is having all of our ways of knowing being in the present moment at the time. So this is, of course, intellectually there, but also our heart brain being there too in this depth of love way, but also our physical selves being there. So that's where we're moving towards being a contemplative. And so this, bringing this back to what we're talking about for this chapter is really the inner part of this. So our interiority, or our inner work that we're doing. And so that's the inner side of this. And there's been talk about this and work on the inner work, contemplative work for centuries. This isn't a new concept by any means. Millennia, actually. But I think we get a little bit distracted with that in the West, and we are very action-oriented. And so we tend to, as a society, try to work through our day-to-day life on the outside. Meaning, sorry about that. I guess I need to drink more coffee. I guess 5 cups isn't enough for one day. So on the outside, we see an issue at work, or we see an issue at home with the family. And what we mostly try to do is solve this from the outside. There's an action for us to do that we see, and that's the approach that we take to try to make it better. And that's not bad. Gee whiz, I might have to re-record this video if it doesn't get better. So we're very action-oriented. We feel like because we're so achievement focused, that the only way to get from here to there, or to solve a problem, or to advance in anything, is to do some sort of action, and that's also good. And so that's really the outside, the exterior piece of this, is looking at this on a surface level. What are the things that could be done to make this thing better, whatever it is. But the real trick of this is when you start balancing this inside and this outside together. And St. Ignatius called that being a contemplative in action. And what that means is that you use your contemplation, your contemplative practices, to enhance your level of awareness or your consciousness, and then allowing that to guide your actions. Okay, that's when we have both. So we all know that you could think of a scenario, and perhaps like a monk at a monastery, or maybe a certain branch of a Catholic nun, where what they do is spend their day in contemplation and pray, but there's not a great deal of action that happens based off of their prayer. And that's not meant to be critical by any means. And then we have completely the other side where we feel like we are sometimes this very non-guided people, awareness-wise anyway, and we go through our day-to-day just solving our to-do list, just bang, 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 without really being very conscious or being very aware of the bigger story that is wrapped around us. And so balancing this inner and the outer is being aware and spending the necessary time in contemplative practices, and then allowing that the senses, the feelings, as many would say, the Holy Spirit working within to guide the actions on the outside. And so that's where the challenge comes for us, because it doesn't seem like we have a great handle on doing both at the same time. We either spend probably too much time in contemplation or spend too much time in the action side without any guidance from the contemplative exercises. And that's where we mostly are, the latter part of that. So it's not just one or the other, but the trick is to have a balance on both. And that contemplation allows us to see the bigger picture. It allows us to see the whole. And here's where this relates to this class, is that allows us to know that we are part of something larger. It allows us to transcend towards something that we feel like we are a part of. And this thing is really big as you start moving in that direction. It might be at first you see that, wow, I am part of something larger. There's a workplace that I'm involved in. It's not just me and doing my job at this workplace, but there's a whole institution wrapped around me of some kind of an organization with people and dynamics, and I'm part of all of that, and I'm an important part of that, but I'm not the only thing here that matters. So that's where we start expanding into this idea of transcendence. I'm part of something larger. And then that grows. I'm part of a larger community. Well, geez, I'm really part of something even bigger than my community. And then that expands, maybe even to the whole, globe, the whole earth, all the people and happenings that are going on earth. And then you can even take that further into saying the entire cosmos, or all that exists, and that you're part of it, an important part of it. And in order for you to feel like you are whole unto yourself, you have to realize that you're just part of the larger whole. And so there's a lot there to kind of balance out. And the only way that those paradoxical ideas, notions, whatever, like that make sense is to try to know something other than just reasoning through it in your intellectual mind. So if we can take that into some kind of context, one of the things that, as you I think know, a lot of my work is in healthcare professionals and their struggles with fatigue and burnout and so forth. And by the way, this also goes, for professions in education and law enforcement and in legal and most service type jobs are experiencing this also now. But strictly, we think about healthcare, the healthcare setting, and the folks who work in that. We struggle with the outer side of this, meaning that the system is very challenging to work within. So you have a healthcare system that is, at best broken, and at worst just a total disaster. And that takes a toll on the folks who work within the system, and it leads those people down this road of chronic fatigue, chronic stress, and burnout, and so forth, and then anxiety and depression, and sometimes even worse. And so there's an outer system that needs a lot of attention, And it's easy for us to say, that's it, that's all there. If we just fix our electronic medical record system, then my life would be so much easier. Or if we would just fix this or just fix that, or if we could do these things, system-wide at my institution, then things would be better. And you can apply that to any of your jobs wherever you work. And so you can see how it'd be easy for us to say, it's out here. There's something out here that if this just gets fixed, then things in here are going to get better. And there's some very much truth to that. But if we also look at the other side of this, that there's some interior work to do as well. And that if we do our own interior work at the same time that this outer work is happening at the workplace, then they two come together, and it's not a inside versus outside. It's not a me versus you. This isn't this othering thing that all of my problems are out there somewhere, and that if those get fixed, then everything in here gets better. It's not that. It's doing the necessary contemplative work allows us to see the bigger picture, the whole, and how we are so connected to the whole that it's a both and conversation. And so that's a balancing of the inner and the outer. And as we keep moving our conversation forward in this idea of wholeness and holism, then that makes more sense. From all sides of this, when we keep tying this back to chronic stress, as we are in this class. So how does the question of the day, how does having greater inner and outer balance improve chronic stress? And improve chronic stress for me personally, but improve chronic stress structurally, okay, within the organization. The stress, and this is not to, overstate this at all, but organizations have chronic stress too. Our country has chronic stress as a whole. We experience this as a whole, chronic stress. And I think it's also fair to say that globally we have chronic stress. I mean, certainly we do environmentally, but we, particularly on the heels of this pandemic, that there's a chronic stress that the greater whole is experiencing. So it's not just looking at stress as in my own personal experience and perception, but is also from an organizational and a corporate and a societal and a global and a cosmological side of point of view of chronic stress. So there's this is the two sides of this, that trying to wrestle with this and come to terms with this, and being okay with what appears to be opposites. And that's many times how we look at this. We're going to get into this in the next couple of this topic in the next couple of weeks, but the idea of our minds always being dualistic, that it's this versus that, it's me versus them, that there is always two sides to things, and these things are always coming into conflict with each other. That's the way we were almost raised to not almost, I feel like that is how most of our society was raised to think. It's that there's an us versus them. If I'm a Cubs fan, then certainly I have to hate the Cardinals, because they're arch rivals in the baseball world, in the National League, and they're close together in cities, St. Louis and Chicago. And so if I'm one, then I certainly have to be the other. So that's just making light of this in a sports analogy, but certainly we see it in this notion of dualism, as it's called, or binary thinking, binary way of life, binary perspective on the world, is that there's always an us versus them, and we see it in politics, we see it in everything else. And so this sometimes the inside and the outside, the inner and the outer, can be viewed the same way, as in conflict, as opposed to being part of the same whole, and absolutely interconnected and interwoven, and critical to work together and to see them as part of the same whole. And that chronic stress or wellness or well-being or appropriate leadership or anything you want to tag to it can't get in that direction unless they're both working together. So more to that to come, but this is why we start this class on the front end looking at wholeness in general, so we kind of get an idea what that means, and then getting into this idea of being interconnected as we talked about in week 2, and then getting into this idea of balancing this inner and outer, and then evolving that into this idea of non-dualism or non-binary way of living. So looking at this, back to the inner and the outer, it is if we want to take this a little bit further, the inner is radical, meaning fundamental acceptance of what is. Okay, we get to the point where we see the world through new eyes, and we can accept everything that is. The good, the bad, and the ugly, everything is part of the same whole. It's not an out there. It's not something outside that we're here and the shadow is over here, but rather it's all part of the same whole. Once we can get ourselves to getting that, wrapping our heads around something that's part of me, but not part of me that's out here, and that I can just, push this away and not have to pay attention to it or deal with it. Once we can get to this point of an acceptance of everything that is, then we're making some real progress. But here's the big but out of the whole thing, and that is we don't have to be in a mindset where we don't do anything about it. Okay, so just because we have acceptance for something doesn't mean there isn't an action required to make it better, to evolve into something that's new or that's better or that's helpful, or that can make life more palatable or less stressful. So that's the action side of it. That's the outside. So inside, radical acceptance of all that is, the good, bad, and the ugly. On the outside, the action that's necessary, the what is mine to do, what is ours to do to make this thing evolve into something more and better. And not for the sake of having more or always trying to make things better, but having the guidance from the contemplative work that we've done and the greater consciousness that we are experiencing that moves us in a direction to say this is what's needed in order for us to have a greater sense of well-being, or to have less stress, or to make the mental health that we're all experiencing better, or the stress that comes from working in a healthcare system or an education system or a governmental system or whatever it is, better. There's always actions that can be done. The right actions are guided by the contemplative practice. So it's both the inner and the outer. So it's a radical letting go. It's getting ourselves to free fall and let go of what is. Okay, let go of the good, the bad, and the ugly. But at the same time, this is the big and in the middle of that, moving forward. We're letting go and we're moving forward at the same time. Paradoxical, concepts for sure, but necessary for us in order to experience this notion of wholeness as we're going forward. Okay, so one of the other concepts that's in this week's work is looking at tinkering and transformation. And even in the book, okay, so this has evolved a little bit for me since the book was published. As you will see in there, it's tinkering versus transformation. And I don't say it like that anymore. It's just tinkering and transformation, because what I've been able to, I think, understand at a greater level since the writing of this book was that the tinkering is absolutely appropriate for the transformation, and that tinkering can actually lead to transformation, and that the tinkering is absolutely necessary in order for us to move forward. Okay, so the tinkering is what I would say the outer layer of making a little adjustments here, little adjustments there to make life better. This is the to-do list that you have. This is the little things that we try to do every day to make ourselves have a better life and to make life better for those around us. And they're all good and they're all necessary. Okay, I don't mean to say tinkering in a bad light at all, because it's absolutely not. And it is necessary. It's a necessary step in the process, and one that can actually lead us towards transformation. if we allow it to. Okay, so this idea of, let's take it in the context of healthy lifestyle behaviors, and that changing a little bit of our eating habits, like maybe eating less sugar, say for instance, is a tinkering practice. But how can that behavior of eating less sugar move us to transformation? So moving us towards greater level of consciousness, moving us towards this place where we're in a position to receive. Okay, so then consciousness even becomes at a greater level, and we can see even more of the whole, and then that guides our actions in the rest of the world. How can eating less sugar? Okay, you don't think I'm crazy, but I might be. But eating less sugar lead us down that road, and this is the topic of the book of Posturing Towards Wholeness that is coming on the heels of Chronically American. So doing any type of tinkering activity allows us, in my view, to be able to experience a relational exchange. Okay, this idea of relationship is so right there, closely tied with this interconnectedness of all things, that we have a relationship, of course, with each other. And we have a relationship, though, not just with each other, but with all things, with nature, with the food we eat, as in the sugar we're eating. And it makes us, so getting back to the sugar, it makes us feel a certain way. And we know, okay, so this could tie in a little science here, but we know that if we eat more sugar, then it releases more stress hormones. And if we have more stress hormones floating around in our blood system, our bloodstream, that it causes us to feel a little more heightened level of stress. And we know that as outlined in the physiological stress response, causes us even to eat more foods and more sugary foods, and then that takes us into a place where we don't feel so well physically. Okay, so if we don't feel well physically, then it's more difficult for us to be in a position to receive. It's more difficult for us to have the level of consciousness that might be required for us to be able to see as we hope to be able to see. The same can be said for exercise, for sleep, for so many other type of behaviors that we do to try to make life better for us. If we use them in a way, if we think of them, I think maybe that's a better way to say it, we experience them in a way that is relational, that we can actually move ourselves in a direction towards transcendence, just by our tinkering type activities. That moves us towards this notion of transformation, and not just trying to eat less sugar because it's going to lower my blood glucose and keep my body weight the way it should be, which are good things, of course, right? But it takes us into something deeper, to the depth that we are hoping to get to in this lifetime in some way. And I think our relational exchange with all that is, particularly with the people, but also with, particularly with nature too, but even what would seem an inanimate object like sugar, for example, is something that we can experience in that way. So our goal in all of this, I think, as I wrap this up, is our movement towards transformation, and that our everyday practices, particularly those that help us to move towards a greater level of consciousness, can move us towards transformation. And that's when well-being is, I think, in the greatest sense of the term, well-being, as we're getting there. We're getting closer to it anyway. So, and of course, if we're there, then stress is a completely different conversation. The chronic stress that we feel is a completely different conversation, and that leads to greater sense of personal wellness and well-being. But also then, I think it's easy to see that our relationships are different with other people, and enhanced and in better way, and that then leads us to a different way of leadership as well. So there's ties to this, all over the place, and that if we really at a fundamental level can move towards transformation, consciousness, to a greater experience of the transcendent, then we're moving in this direction that allows us to have greater sense of wholeness and well-being, and it makes us better leaders for sure. So that's where we are this week, and I hope this makes sense. But I'm looking forward to maybe some greater conversation about this at our next Zoom meeting that we have in week 4. And also hopefully to read what your thoughts are when we get to the discussion part and your reflection papers for this week. So anyway, as usual, if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you soon. See ya.